Many games throughout gaming history have caused controversy and pissed some people off. Let's take a trip down memory lane with a cool head and look back at 8 of the most offensive AAA games of all time. Starting off with number 8, we might as well start with the one that started it all, the original Mortal Kombat. Mortal Kombat, when it originally released to arcades in 1992, absolutely took the world by storm, dude. It was developed by Midway Games, and of course, co-created by Ed Boon and John Tobias. And with it becoming such a hugely popular game, with people practically lining up at the arcade cabinet to play it, of course, eventually more scrutinizing eyes would take a look at it, and that being the media, parents, politicians, anyone, you name it, specifically around the game's intense violence, with the fact that the characters on screen were technically images of real people, like digitized images, but also being depicted with insanely over-the-top gore, with blood and effects and heads getting ripped off and skulls and everything. You know Mortal Kombat by now. That caught the attention of a lot of people. Specifically, the main buzzword was the fatalities, the big finishing moves with the over-the-top and like brutal, obnoxious ways of killing your opponents and really humiliating them. By 1993, a lot of US politicians were fed up with this whole thing, and there was a big old congressional hearing, hot off the heels of Mortal Kombat and other games like Night Trap really being big in the media for their gore, and the fact that Mortal Kombat was also popping off on home console release by that time. It was on both Nintendo and Sega platforms, but Nintendo had it censored at the time, but still, it didn't matter. It led to more media scrutiny, more angry parents, and more politicians doing their hearings and all that. And it continued over to Mortal Kombat 2 and beyond. But the original Mortal Kombat, the home console release, was actually banned in certain countries. It was really one of the first games to go all in on the gore, and it had to suffer the consequences for that. But thankfully, Mortal Kombat lived on, and we're still really playing the series to this day. It is considered one of the games that heralded the creation of the ESRB, you know, an established rating system for games. And Mortal Kombat's history, whether people found it offensive or not, is really significant and left a large footprint in the gaming world. Next, over at number 7, something a little bit more tame but still worth pointing out is the controversy around Bully. Yes, big surprise, a Rockstar Games game was not so warmly received by some people, specifically with Bully and how it was centered around, you guessed it, bullying. Really, it was the title itself for a lot of people, with the fact that it was actually given a different name in certain countries to kind of tame it down. A lot of this came down to the fact that Rockstar Games was already in a lot of hot water and had a lot of attention for the Grand Theft Auto series, so the same people that criticized those games jumped on Bully before it even released. Of course, former famous Florida lawyer and basically anti-video game crusader Jack Thompson was screaming from the rooftops that this game was a bad influence and it was essentially a Columbine simulator, which is a pretty wild accusation, but it wasn't just the United States. There were movements in the UK and Brazil to also get the game banned, and they all had varying degrees of success, but ultimately in North America, Bully released on time. It was only rated T for teen, and it wasn't really that big of a deal. To the point where, in fact, when the game was proposed to be banned from certain stores, a judge ruled that there wasn't anything in this game that you wouldn't see on TV. And Bully really ultimately just ended up being a don't judge a book by its cover type thing, because there really wasn't much to it, and it certainly didn't harm the youth. In fact, in the game, half the time, you're not even doing the bullying.
You little worm, you better run the class right now.
And that reminds us, we need to make more videos about Bully. We're long overdue, so let us know in the comments if you want to see something like that. Now, next over at number 6, we have BMX XXX. This game definitely offended a lot of people because of its crude marketing and really the whole dumb idea behind it. Essentially, it was from the people behind the Dave Mirra BMX series, and they wanted to inject new life into the franchise for the 3rd game, and they tried to brand it into this crazy, crude humor, gross out, but also over-sexualized thing to make BMX more exciting. I mean, if you ask me, I don't think BMX needs anything to be exciting. It's already pretty awesome. But apparently the absolutely crazy video game executives at Acclaim at the time thought that topless girls was really going to be the thing to sell the next big BMX extreme sports game. If anything, it seemed to offend Dave Mirra the most, you know, the late famous BMX champion, because he distanced himself from the project and ultimately still ended up suing the publisher specifically because of the damage it did to his name. I don't think it really harmed his name that much, although things did heat up because there were reports that toy stores like Toys R Us, big retailers like Walmart and places like that were refusing to sell the game, and ultimately some of that may have impacted some of its success. I played this game as like a gross little creepy teenager back in the day, and I think the most offensive thing of the game was like its really bad attempts at humor. A lot of the jokes were just totally cringy. They were trying to go for like a Jackass American Pie thing when that was the big thing, but it definitely didn't land. I think BMX XXX is an example of a game that was offensive in the news for a period of time, but ultimately not offensive enough because it just ended up being completely forgotten by modern gamers. Next down at number 5, we gotta talk Conker's Bad Fur Day, a game that I think is really just offensive to older, more uptight people who never enjoyed a cartoon or really anything vaguely raunchy. Conker's Bad Fur Day was one of the swan songs of the Nintendo 64. In fact, I think it's one of the best Nintendo 64 games, and it was almost like at that point, Nintendo, interestingly enough, didn't allow a ton of like really gross M-rated games on their platform. There was Doom and, you know, like the Resident Evil port, but Conker's Bad Fur Day kind of felt like Nintendo had moved on to the next console and kind of let the youngest sibling do whatever it wanted and get away with anything, and that youngest sibling happened to be Conker's Bad Fur Day. Do you get the analogy I'm trying to get at here? It was a rare game, and on the surface it looked like another Banjo-Kazooie fun cartoony type game, but this cartoony squirrel loved to get drunk. He loved boobs, he said a lot of bad words, and there was tons of over-the-top gore. And it ultimately ended up being absolutely hilarious and an incredibly memorable game. It's hard to find a ton of information on it, but controversial at the time, Nintendo of Europe didn't want to publish it, and the LA Times did publish a piece talking to some parents about the game with quotes like, "This is disgusting, sophomoric humor, I'm disappointed in Nintendo, it's like Disney releasing pornography." Apparently KB Toys didn't want to carry the game, and to be fair to Nintendo, they did slap an extra big warning on the game's box art. There was, of course, the M rating on the bottom corner, but there was also a big, long, white label on the bottom of the box that kind of looked like a cigarette health warning label. It says, "Advisory, the game is not for anyone under age 17. You know, as if like the over-sexualized squirrel girl and the drunk cartoon squirrel guy holding a beer on the box wasn't enough for you.
Not if I do.
Ultimately, where I'm at is that they remade this game for the original Xbox, but they need to remake it again because more people still need to play it. It's really funny and dumb, in a good way. Next, over at number 4, we have Postal. Now, the Postal series started off controversial, and now I think in modern day, it's trying to chase that controversy, like it wants that attention again. But back in the day, Postal 2, specifically in 2003, the one to switch from an isometric shooter over to a first-person shooter, was the one that definitely got a lot of attention, specifically because you were just kind of like a guy going around murdering everyone. You pee on stuff, you murder people, you brutalize people with weapons, guns, explosions, everything. And people weren't happy about that. It was banned in New Zealand with possibly having a fine for keeping the game. They tried to ban it in Sweden. Some German versions of it were taken down digitally. And really, ultimately, from Postal 1 to Postal 2, I don't really think it amounted to much. It was kind of trying to be satirical, holding a mirror up to how gross everything is in the world. It was structured around days where you, as the postal dude, would go out and do random everyday tasks, but also just murder everyone. To be honest, if you talk to some gamers, the most offensive thing about the Postal games was that they were never really that much fun to play to begin with. Controversy, things in games that just like piss people off, all that aside, if a game isn't that fun to play, that's it, man. Next, down at number 3, we have yet another headline-grabbing Rockstar Games game, Manhunt. Manhunt originally released in 2003, back in the day when Rockstar was riding high from all that GTA money and just making a bunch of weird, quirky projects. This was a little bit more of like a third-person stealth adventure game in a really dark and gritty, gross universe, kind of stylized as a sort of snuff film. Now, in this game, you played as James Earl Cash, who is a death row inmate who is thrust into this place where he is forced to to kill to survive, but it gets much, much darker than that. But the whole thing was really just gritty and icky and gross and centered very much around murdering enemies gruesomely and brutally and really intimately with small weapons from like knives down to stuff like strangling a dude with a plastic bag. This game grabbed attention of some politicians who then went to sponsor special legislation to fine people who would sell adult-oriented games to people under the age of 17. US Rep Joe Baca is quoted as saying, "It's telling kids how to kill someone, and it uses vicious, sadistic, and cruel methods to kill." Manhunt received tons of media coverage. Parents obviously flipped out. There's tons of quotes from parents out there that you can find. And we're not really gonna go into it too deep because we don't like to do the whole true crime thing, but it was loosely attached to an unfortunate murder in the UK where a 17-year-old murdered a 14-year-old. The game was blamed. And regardless of that case, still the controversy around the game led to bans in certain countries like, of course, New Zealand, Australia, and some issues in Canada, and of course, tons of scrutiny in the United States by none other than good old Jack Thompson, who said, and I quote, "We have had dozens of killings in the United States by children who had played these types of games. These types of games are basically murder simulators." Look, I'm not a parent. The game is rated M for a reason. I don't think I would let a kid play this game, but Manhunt definitely went on to have a cult following, and if you're into like gritty, gruesome horror, this definitely is something that you've seen in movies before, sure, but not quite in video games. The game did manage to go on and have a sequel too, where people got riled up again.
Break him.
Next, over at number 2, we talked about Rockstar games a ton, so of course we have to mention Grand Theft Auto. The Grand Theft Auto series existed for years, sure, but things really turned around when Grand Theft Auto 3 released. This was the game's big, full shift to open world 3D, and it was the first time players really saw something like that, where you were free to run around, crash into whoever you wanted, murder whoever you want, do whatever you want, and it was also the first time parents got to see their kids play something like this, and they were subsequently horrified. You know, from committing mass murder to mowing down police to beating up prostitutes, the game certainly earned its M rating, and we didn't really see anything else like that at the time, so of course people flipped out. This was really, for me, the other big footnote in video game history, where it kind of leapfrogged from Mortal Kombat, Night Trap days over to this. Grand Theft Auto was and continues to be the scapegoat. And it went on for years. It wasn't just with 3, of course. There's the whole hot coffee thing, the game depicting sex thing that we've talked about in many videos that made headlines and caught the eye of politicians, to more modern stuff like Grand Theft Auto 5 having some racy torture scenes that bothered some people. Really, I think at this point, it's like what Grand Theft Auto is gonna do. GTA is just going to offend people. I mean, most recently, the GTA Trilogy Definitive Edition remaster re-release thing of the original games definitely offended gamers by just coming out in poor quality. But hey, let's move on. Down to number 1, we have Modern Warfare 2. No, not the new Modern Warfare, the other Modern Warfare 2 from 2009. Are we in a time machine? Are things just coming back around? Anyway, the original Modern Warfare 2 had a pretty spicy campaign sequence that you've probably heard of called No Russian. This was a mission where you were essentially a CIA operative in deep undercover with Russian terrorists and the Russian terrorist leader Makarov. And they had this complex plan to kick something off, but ultimately a lot of that started with them going into a public airport and essentially committing mass murder, mass shooting. So you, as the player, would follow all these other terrorists around this airport, shooting up innocent civilians. Interestingly enough, you could skip this sequence, and you also didn't necessarily have to fire your gun at civilians. It was less of a gameplay thing and more of a storytelling thing. A lot of different types of people from all walks of life were not really happy about this. It was a game where you essentially committed a terrorist attack, and countries were not happy with that. The level was removed from Russian versions of the game. It was rated to high hell and totally disclaimed as a super mature rated game in Australia, the United States. And ultimately, you can say that it was a bold story choice. They tried to do something here. I don't know what it really accomplished. There's not enough time in this video to really dig into that, but it was yet another thing that definitely brought some heat onto video games as a medium. So those are some games throughout gaming history that offended some people for various reasons. We covered a lot in this video, but we tried to keep it pretty even-keeled, so we'd love to hear what you think in the comments. Please don't freak out. But if you like really just talking about video game history more than anything, let us know what you're thinking. And if you enjoyed learning about this stuff, clicking the like button helps us out. We'd really appreciate that. But if you're new, consider subscribing because we put out videos every single day. Either way, thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.